Daddy.
Howdy! Welcome to the Whiskey Butler. I am your host, Wesley Butler, and I am here to spread some whiskey wisdom today. Alright, first episode. Today, we're going to talk about what is whiskey, right? The true definition of American whiskey. And the true definition of American whiskey, or just whiskey in general, is it is a spirit or an alcoholic beverage distilled from a grain mash bill, right? That's it. That's all it is. For us Americans here, which is why we spell our whiskey with an E, Americans here, that definition was actually cemented in 1909 by the Taft decision. Taft, being William Howard Taft, who was serving as the president of the United States at that time. And did you know, by the way, a little short fact, a little tangent, William Howard Taft is the only person to ever serve as President of the United States and Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. So, just a little fact. Okay, but in 1909, President William Taft was approached by whiskey distillers and their consummate enemies, the whiskey rectifiers, to actually clarify what is whiskey, right? There's been this long-standing battle about whiskey, blended whiskey, imitation whiskey. We'd already had the Bottled and Bond Act, 1897. We'd already had the Pure Food and Drug Act, 1906. But it just kept coming up, so came to President Taft and said, hey, we need you to lay down some rules. And so after some time, that's what he did. Taft decision, where he laid out what is whiskey, which he said it is a spirit distilled from grain, what is blended whiskey, what is imitation whiskey, and many of the things that came down from his ruling are actually still present today, right? So, President Taft gave us what is whiskey, and so we move on from there. So, whiskey is distilled from grains. Okay, but what kind of grains? Got to be distilled from whole grains. So we have some whole grains here. We got a little barley here. We got a little wheat here, it's bulgur wheat here, and then we got some corn right here, okay? So, what is a whole grain? Well, a whole grain, by definition, is a grain that has three parts still intact. Those three parts are the endosperm, the germ, and the bran, right? So you got the endosperm, the bran, and the germ, and when all three are still intact, you have a whole grain. If it's missing one, you don't have a whole grain, but that's okay. All right. So, but since this is not an agricultural discussion, we will get back to the whiskey. So we got our whole grains, and we're gonna distill them, and then we're gonna make whiskey. Okay. So, what makes American whiskey American whiskey? Well, it's because we have rules, right? I mean, we just got rules on rules on rules, and whiskey is no different. So, if you do a quick internet search of what is American whiskey, you'll get a ton of different websites, and you'll get all these different categories, but I've already done that, so I'm going to give you my categories of American whiskey. First, you got bourbon. Everybody knows about bourbon. Second, we got Tennessee whiskey. Third, we got corn whiskey. Fourth, we have what I like to call just whiskey. And then we also have, the last three, we have our spirit whiskey, blended whiskey, and light whiskey. Okay? We're not going to talk about bourbon today. We'll get into that in plenty of future episodes. We're not going to talk about Tennessee whiskey today. We'll get into that in future episodes. Corn whiskey we're going to get into in part 2 of this episode, but today I want to focus on that just whiskey category, okay? So we're going to talk about just whiskey today. I have the three grains here: corn, wheat, barley. Rye is another commonly used grain in bourbon. But if you're going to call something wheat whiskey, rye whiskey, what does that mean? Well, first off, your namesake grain has to make up at least 51% of the mash bill, right? So if you're going to make a rye whiskey, it got to be at least 51% rye. I mean, that only makes sense, right? Well, there are a few other requirements that go into it. One, it has to be distilled no higher than 80% alcohol by volume, which is 160 proof, right? Anything higher than that, you're going to get into your tequilas and your gins. And whiskey enthusiasts or whiskey purists will tell you that you're going to lose a lot of the flavor if you distill it that high. Okay, so still 80% alcohol by volume. Can't go into the container that it ages in any higher than 62.5% alcohol by volume. That's 130 proof. And then it has to go into the bottle at no less than 40% alcohol by volume. That is 80 proof. And then bam, you got some whiskey. But I know there's some people out there going, but Wesley, you didn't talk about how long it's got to be in the barrel and so on and so forth. Okay, let me get to that. So first off, there's no aging requirement to be considered a whiskey, right? Now, you have to go into the container. Doesn't have to be a barrel, just has to be an oak container, okay? And it's got to be charred oak container, right? Bam, there you go, whiskey. Now, if we were talking about scotch or something else, right, they actually put their stuff into used containers, but we're not talking about scotch whiskey right now. We're talking about American whiskey. American whiskey, new charred oak containers, okay? No age, it could go in for 1 day. I mean, that's not very cost efficient, but it could go in for 1 day, bam, meets the definition of whiskey, okay? So those are our definitions, and let's just go ahead and get to the whiskey that we're gonna talk about today. Okay, so I already mentioned the most common grains that go into whiskey: wheat, corn, rye, barley. But the whiskey we're gonna talk about today, 100% oat whiskey. Okay, yep. My producer tells me that I gotta turn the bottle around. Yep, there we go. 100% oat whiskey. So there are my oat grains, my rolled oats right here. Now you might be saying, I've never heard of oat whiskey. Well, you would not be the first person to say that. But I personally like whiskeys and bourbons that have oat in them. So I love oatmeal for breakfast in the morning. I love oatmeal raisin cookies, and when I was growing up, I used to get oatmeal, the Little Debbie oatmeal cream pies, right? I used to get those in my lunch all the time. Scrumptious. I mean, I don't eat them now, but I used to eat them all the time growing up, right? So oatmeal is like in my blood. So when I think of oat in a whiskey, or I just think, man, that actually should be pretty good, right? And if you think about all the flavors that each of these different grains, like oat should really kind of mellow out, you know, the whiskey that you're drinking, right? So, okay. So I picked up this 100%, this Owlbear Oat Whiskey. I picked this up on a trip to Frederick, Maryland a couple weeks ago. Dragon Distillery. You should check them out. They have axe throwing there. I mean, axe throwing and whiskey drinking all at the same time. I am in insurance, and that's literally like an insurance nightmare right there. But they do it. It's cool. I didn't do any axe throwing while I was there, but I did taste some whiskey. So when I saw 100% oat whiskey, I mean, I did have to ask the purveyors of the establishment. I was like, this is for real? This is 100% oat? They're like, yeah, 100% oat. Oh, and if you also notice, it is a straight oat whiskey. Now, in order to be called a straight whiskey, you have to age or mature, whichever word you want to use, in a barrel for at least 2 years, right? That's actually one of the things that came down in the Taft decision, right? And that applies to all whiskeys, right? If you're gonna be called straight, you gotta age in your container for at least 2 years. And that goes for any state: Kentucky, Tennessee, Texas, Minnesota, California, whatever, right? Now, the trick is you gotta age for 2 years in that state in the container, right? So you can't age for 2 years, one in Texas and one in Tennessee, and call yourself a straight Tennessee whiskey or a straight Texas whiskey. You got to age for 2 years in that state. Okay, but I digress. This whiskey right here was aged, it says no less than 2 years, right? So we actually don't know how long it was in, but we know it was at least in the container. It actually says charred barrels for at least 2 years. So that's good enough for me. That's where it gets its color from. So oat whiskey, so I've already had this, and so I was pleasantly surprised. I was pleasantly surprised with the taste. So we're gonna go ahead and, so the nose on it isn't very strong, but you wouldn't expect the nose on it to be strong. I mean, think of a bowl of oatmeal, right? I mean, does a bowl of oatmeal just like hit you in the face with the smell? No, it does not. And neither does this whiskey, but that's okay. That's okay. Yeah, it's very mellow. It's very mellow. It's not too strong. Well, what's the proof on this? 92 proof, right? So we're not talking entry level here in the low to mid 80s, right? I mean, we're at least over 92 proof. But yeah, it doesn't have a kick like you get from some rye or whatever. It's not overly smooth because it only aged for 2 years, right? But the oak part of it, in my opinion, smooths it. It doesn't need that long in a barrel to smooth out, right? I say right, as if you would know, right? Because you're not sitting here drinking the whiskey and I'm drinking the whiskey. But anyway, I really like this oat whiskey. I mean, as soon as I had it, I said, yeah, I'm gonna have to go ahead and buy this. So props to the people at Dragon Distillery for this 100% oat whiskey. And so that is my talk for part 1 of this episode. We talked about just whiskey right now. Hope you'll join me for part 2 where we're talking about corn whiskey. But I appreciate you watching and catch you next time on the Whiskey Butler.